Coming up on this Monday edition of Newsline at noon, as the South Korean government prepares for upcoming high-level talks with Pyongyang, top U.S. diplomats visit Seoul to coordinate the two countries' North Korea policy. Korea's central bank warns a serious shortfall in tax collection could threaten the domestic economic recovery. Plus, hundreds of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong defy the government's deadline to disperse, but the demonstrations have begun easing off as the city returns to work. These stories and more on Newsline at noon. It's new Monday, October 6th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in live from Seoul. I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broome. We start with news that two high-level U.S. officials are in Seoul right now for talks. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Russell and Assistant Secretary of Defense David Shear held talks with Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se as well as Deputy Foreign Minister Lee Kyung-soo.
For the latest, let's go straight to our correspondent Hwang Seung-hee at the Foreign Ministry. So, Seung-hee, what brings these two senior U.S. officials to South Korea?
Jin-joo, Mark, not much information about today's discussion has been released yet, but Assistant Secretary Russell said they talked about regional issues, including Korea-Japan relations, as well as the recent visit by a high-level North Korean delegation. Now, the visit is very timely, considering it just comes 2 days after a rare one-day visit by a high-ranking North Korean delegation. The two visiting U.S. officials held a short press briefing following the meetings, in which Mr. Russell reiterated U.S. support for South Korean efforts to promote and enhance inter-Korean relations. Now, I was present for the beginning of their meeting with Minister Yoon, and he stressed the importance of close coordination between Seoul and Washington, not just on issues related to the Korean Peninsula, but also on both regional and global issues. The U.S. officials will now be heading over to the presidential office of Cheongwade this afternoon for more discussions on North Korea and inter-Korean ties before they leave for Tokyo in the evening. This has been Hwang Seung-hee reporting from the Foreign Ministry.
Now, at the nation's top office, President Park Geun-hye has suggested holding high-level talks between the two Koreas on a regular basis rather than a one-time event as part of efforts to realize a peaceful reunification.
Yes, at Monday's Chief Secretary meeting, President Park expressed hope the recent visit by three top North Korean officials could open the door for peace through dialogue. She also urged related ministries to prepare for the new round of high-level talks that are slated to be held between late October and early November. They would represent the second of their kind during the Park administration. Topics up for discussion could include a resumption of family reunions for families separated since the Korean War, of course, Pyongyang's nuclear program, and also the potential lifting of economic sanctions on the north.
Now, North Korea appears to have shut down a 5-megawatt reactor at its key nuclear site, one of its major sources of weapons-grade plutonium. While it's not clear why activity at the site has ceased, a U.S.-based institute suggests the shutdown could be to allow for partial refueling or renovations. Kwon Soo tells us what this could mean.
Activity at North Korea's main nuclear site may have come to a partial or complete halt. Citing recent satellite imagery, the U.S.-based Institute for Science and International Security says a comparison of images made in August and September with earlier ones shows a lack of steam venting from the 5-megawatt reactor's turbine and a lack of water being discharged from its cooling system. The U.S. think tank says the reason for the shutdown is not clear, but it could be for refueling or renovation, raising concerns radioactive plutonium could be extracted during this process. The reactor is a main source of the North's weapons-grade material. It's estimated the reactor can produce 6 kilograms of plutonium a year, which is enough for one nuclear bomb. Nuclear tests have been conducted using plutonium produced at the Yongbyon reactor in previous years, including North Korea's most recent nuclear test in February of last year. A couple of months after that, Pyongyang said it would restart its aged reactor at the Yongbyon nuclear complex amid high regional tensions. The reactor had been shut down in 2007 under an aid for disarmament accord. The think tank also reports that activity has been spotted in other parts of the nuclear site. Satellite imagery shows roofs being renovated at another plant on the south side of the site that's known to store centrifuges which are used to enrich uranium. But the institute added it wasn't sure whether the expansion of the centrifuges had been completed. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
There are growing calls out of Japan to limit U.S. access to Japanese military bases in the event of a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. In a report released Sunday outlining discussions from July's Pacific Forum held in the United States, Japanese security experts said the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty signed in 1960 is outdated and should be revised. They said Washington should be required to seek approval from Tokyo before using Japanese combat bases. That echoes similar statements from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in recent months and comes on the heels of Japan's shift away from its pacifist constitution. And on to some risk factors facing the Korean economy. The government failed to collect half its tax revenue target in the first half of this year. Now, this has made analysts worry that a shortfall in tax collection, together with the high local currency and sluggish consumer spending, could hinder the nation's economic recovery. Song Jae-san reports.
Not meeting the government's goal of tax collection could be one of the major downside risks threatening the Korean economy. In a report submitted to National Assembly on Monday, the Bank of Korea said a shortfall in tax collection could hurt the economic recovery, along with external factors like slowing demand in the Eurozone. Ruling party lawmaker Park Myung-jae, a member of the Assembly's Finance Committee, also expressed concerns the government collected less than half of its targeted tax revenue in the first 6 months of this year. That's the lowest collection rate in 16 years. Data from the National Tax Service shows tax revenue totaled $119 billion in the January to July period, a mere 58% of its goal. The government collected some $8 billion less than it had projected last year, and the Finance Ministry expects a similar shortfall this year as well. Lower than expected tax collection means the government must cut its expenditure unless it manages to issue bonds to fill the gap. That will deal a blow to the government's plan to boost much-needed economic activities at home. The central bank has already warned that the strength of the local currency and a lower-than-expected recovery in consumer and investor sentiment could slow economic growth. A member of the central bank's Monetary Policy Committee said the Finance Ministry might have been too optimistic when setting their tax revenue goal. Song Jae-sun, Arirang News.
Now, the value of the Japanese yen has dropped by more than twice the value of the Korean won over the past 3 months on the back of the strengthening US dollar. An index tracking the greenback against 6 other major currencies shows the dollar recorded a near 8% gain since the end of June. The Japanese yen dropped 7.6% to the greenback to around 110 yen last month. The Korean won fell by a mere 4% over the same period. This has also affected Korea's foreign exchange reserves, which contracted for the second consecutive month in September to $364.4 billion. The National Assembly will begin its annual parliamentary hearings on Tuesday. Standing committees will call in officials from close to 700 government offices over a 20-day period to question them on their spending and the implementation of policies. The ruling party says it hopes the inspections focus on tackling administrative issues and coming up with policy alternatives rather than becoming extra causes of political strife. The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy says it's most concerned about inspecting offices related to April's Seoul ferry disaster. There are already worries the long drawn-out dispute over a special bill to investigate the sinking will prevent the audits running in a smooth and timely manner. Now, the war-renouncing article of the Japanese constitution has been chosen as the most likely candidate to win this year's Nobel Peace Prize that's set to be announced later this week, on Friday in actual fact. If this becomes reality, the Abe administration in Japan will come under a great deal of international pressure to rein in its military ambitions. Our Song Jung-in reports.
Each year, the Oslo Peace Research Institute forecasts the most likely winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and this time it has selected Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. The institute noted the article's renunciation of war and the use of force assume much greater importance amid military tensions in Ukraine and other parts of the world. The article renounces the right to engage in war and rejects the use of force as a means of settling international disputes. However, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's reinterpretation of the article in July caused the protests to erupt in Japan. Against Abe's approach to allow for military expansion, Naomi Takasu, an ordinary housewife from Kanagawa Prefecture, initiated a campaign to highlight Article 9 in the Nobel Peace Prize selection. After garnering more than 400,000 signatures, the Norwegian Nobel Committee tasked with picking the peace laureate accepted his recommendation to include Article 9 as a candidate in April. Among the other contenders this year are Pope Francis, Congolese gynecologist Denis Mukwege, and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. If Japanese peace activists clinch the prize, it will likely put intense pressure on the Abe government to step back from its military ambitions. The Nobel Peace Prize winner will be announced on Friday. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
Now, let's get a check on some of the other global headlines we're following at this hour. We're going to turn to our Eunice Kim, who's standing by for us, as always, at the News Center for that.
Eunice, the Hong Kong government's deadline demanding demonstrators to clear out has passed with the start of the work week. How's things looking there?
Well, Jin-joo, the streets are looking a lot emptier than it was in the weekend, which marked one full week since the massive sit-ins began. Schools are reopening, as are government offices, though some protesters stayed on the major roads, promising to remain until their leaders are able to agree with the government on how to move forward. Our Connie Kim has this story.
Pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong have defied the government's Monday deadline to clear out of streets near government headquarters. Although crowds have thinned out compared to last week, thousands rallied overnight calling for democracy in the city-state. Over 100 people still occupy an area in front of Chief Executive C.Y. Leung's office. Leung vowed over the weekend that public offices and schools will reopen this Monday, even if it means using police to break up the protests. No significant police movements have been spotted, but tensions are rising as more demonstrators say they'll join the main protest site in Admiralty. Protesters and government officials are trying to start dialogue, but they remain deeply at odds with one another. The student protesters want their leaders to be treated equally and for political change to emerge from talks. Government officials are calling for protesters to clear the way around government buildings and main roads. Rallies in the heart of Hong Kong started late last month with demonstrators demanding universal suffrage in 2017 elections and that Beijing abandon its plan to vet candidates for the post of chief executive. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
And turning next to some election news in Brazil, incumbent President Dilma Rousseff is set to face her center-right challenger Aécio Neves in a runoff vote in about 3 weeks' time. With about 99% of the votes counted, Rousseff fell short of an outright majority, clinching 41% of the votes cast in Sunday's elections. Her pro-business rival secured a solid second with 33%, while popular former Environment Minister Marina Silva only took 21% of the ballots, despite earlier polls that showed her with a double-digit lead. Voting in the world's 7th largest economy is mandatory for citizens between 18 and 70 years old. Brazilians also selected members of Congress and state governors in this round of elections. In the U.S., the director of the CDC, Tom Frieden, says America's first Ebola patient, Thomas Eric Duncan, is fighting for his life, slipping back into a state of critical condition after showing some initial improvement. Frieden also said his agency received well over 100 inquiries on suspicious cases in recent months. He confirmed they were watching about 50 people for a period of 21 days, which is Ebola's maximum incubation period. This as help is beginning to pour into Ebola-ravaged West Africa. Britain, China, and Cuba have sent teams into Sierra Leone as the U.S. deploys some 4,000 military personnel into Liberia. The New York Times reports several shipping containers filled with donated medical supplies remain tied up at shipping docks in Sierra Leone for months due to logistical issues. And finally, a local official told Reuters Kurdish forces are engaged in some of their heaviest battles so far against Islamic State militants in the border frontier of Syria and Turkey. The official spoke of very heavy bomb shelling and machine gun fire as the jihadists were a mere kilometer away from southeast Kobani. Reports also say IS fighters took a strategic hill overlooking the predominantly Kurdish town. CNN reports the Turkish government was using tear gas and water cannons against people trying to join the IS fight across the border.
On this week's Industry Insight, Korean street food stuffs like tteokbokki, sundae, 어묵 is loved by everyone in the country regardless of their age or gender. And these dishes are known for being very reasonably priced.
Yeah, you can pick up a big meal for about $5 US. And they are actually, there's one very popular restaurant out there that's taking the street out of street food and serving more kind of upscale adaptations of these very popular dishes at its restaurants, not only in Korea, but also in several countries around Asia and also in the US. Shin Se-min has this week's Industry Insight.
It certainly looks different. It's not the spicy red gochujang-based paste tteokbokki that we're used to, and these miniature kimbaps called bari are different in their size, but they're tasty. And even though they come at a higher price than the traditional dish that inspired them, people dig them. Here, popular Korean street food, or punshik, is served with a high-end touch. School Food, a franchise Korean restaurant, is making money by offering an upscale version of Korean street food like kimbap or, say, tteokbokki in a spicy carbonara sauce.
I come here often because you can't get these type of tteokbokki elsewhere.
So I've tried school food before in Hong Kong, and I've been there twice, and that's why I would quite like to try the original restaurant in Seoul. It offers like fusion Korean food, which is very different to traditional Korean food.
Since starting out 12 years ago, the franchise has beefed up in size with 80 stores nationwide. Last year, School Food posted sales of $85 million.
This is a new type of Korean food. A twist to the already tasty Korean dish is what attracts both Korean and foreign diners. And people like that, they can enjoy casual Korean food in a nice, clean restaurant.
And it's going global, with a total of 10 restaurants in places like Hong Kong, Jakarta, Bangkok, Hanoi, and Los Angeles. You've come this far, and what's the toughest part of your job in expanding your business overseas? I mean, in the global market, school food is not yet well known. Is it going to be a tough road ahead?
Of course, it is a difficult road ahead, even with our dish. I mean, although this uniqueness gathers attention regardless of nationality, this will wear out, and people will get bored. But just as customers still pay visits to McDonald's and Starbucks over other stores, my ultimate goal is to establish the brand image in their minds so they come back years after.
Lee says he has been receiving a number of calls from people overseas who are interested in opening up school food restaurants abroad. And while that's something he welcomes over the long term, Lee says he first wants to tackle the Southeast Asian market, where the palates of diners are similar to those here in Korea. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
And in other news, Consumer Reports has given Korea's electronics giants high marks in its recent review of the best and worst products of the year. The American magazine says Samsung has the best smartphone, tablet PC, and big refrigerator on the market at the moment. LG saw one of their washing machines and electric ranges atop their respective categories. Given the two companies' reputations, you might think one of them would find themselves at number one in the TV category, but that honor went to Sony and its 65-inch Bravia model. Consumer Reports publishes reviews and comparisons of products based on assessment results from its own test lab. Korean and Japanese companies are among the most frequent violators of antitrust laws in the United States. The Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry says Korean firms have been forced to pay nearly $1.3 billion in fines dating back to 1995. That's nearly one-third the amount levied on Japanese companies during the same period. The report recommends that local companies clean up their business practices to put them more on par with international standards as they're increasingly expanding overseas. China has been strengthening its anti-corruption laws of late and recently slapped a $500 million fine on a multinational pharmaceutical company on bribery charges.
Now, if you've seen an opera or a musical recently, there's a good chance you were thoroughly impressed by the costumes worn by the performers. Now, once thought of as kind of an afterthought in many Korean productions, the visual appearance of performers on stage is now taking a much bigger role these days. Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
One of Korea's best-known folk tales and love stories, Chunhyangjeon, has been reborn in the form of a ballet. And it's the costumes that are sticking out in the performance. It took more than 6 months to complete the stage outfits, which took a classical ballet twist on the hanbok, Korea's traditional dress.
Hanbok contains the spirit of Koreans. The materials and colors that hanbok is made of exudes the spirit. I wanted to show those features of hanbok to the world.
A battle of warriors dressed in red and blue grabs the audience's attention. The silhouette of the costumes accentuate the dancers' waists and hip lines, adding to the impact of their choreographed dance.
I tried to emphasize the confrontation mode by differentiating their outfits. The costumes of one side are inspired by Western clothing, while the others are inspired by Oriental dresses.
And for the Korea National Opera's production of the Shakespearean love story Romeo and Juliet, a globally renowned designer is in charge of the stage costumes. As costumes are now taking more important roles in breathing life into the characters of a performance, more production money is being poured into creating costumes that perfectly fit the opera's story and music.
The most important thing about costumes for the theatre is that they tell the audience about the character. They should tell you the age of the character, and the status, and the class.
And thanks to these elaborate costumes that are taking center stage, audiences not only get to enjoy dramatic performances, but also vivid and bold fashions under the theater spotlight. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Mostly sunny skies will dominate the whole peninsula before clouds roll in later in the day. And due to the indirect influence of the 18th typhoon of the season, Phanphon, southern coastal regions and Jeju will be indirectly affected by it till tomorrow. And you know, it was quite chilly this morning, starting in the low teens in many areas, and the afternoon highs will only rise to low 20s across the nation. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the readings for today. Now, the daytime high in the capital will be only at 21, and Daegu and Busan will rise to 22, while Gwangju will peak at 23 this afternoon. And for other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon will see highs of 21, and Dokdo peaks at 16. Now, the weather outlook for the rest of the week is looking calm and cool. Lows will be on the chilly reside in the low teens, while highs will be hovering in the low to mid-20s. So it's going to be quite cool out there. So don't forget to dress in layers to keep yourself warm. That's all for Korea, and here's the international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, those are the stories we're following at this hour.
Mark and I'll be back at the same time on Tuesday. Thank you for watching.